guys, welcome back to the GM's table. So if you haven't noticed, this is a different frame. It says let's run Savage Worlds. It's because I'm going to do something a little different. These aren't the vlogs. Hopefully I'm going to try and still do them one take style. But when I talked about the games I care about and what I'm going to talk about most, I said how I'm going to talk about Savage Worlds more. And sadly with the vlogs, I'm talking about Savage Worlds a lot, but it's kind of equal. And that's fine, because a lot of what I'm talking about in these lists is kind of generic things. Generic GMing things I want to cover before anything else. Which means sometimes Savage Worlds will be brought, but I don't want to say sadly, because it's not a bad thing. But a lot of times I refer to D&D, because it's what most people are familiar with. So I wanted to do something special just for Savage Worlds. On top of that, I'm going to put a link down here to someone's channel named Matt Coville. It's someone I respect tremendously. He does basically exclusively D&D stuff, but his GM advice is solid. And one of the things he does is he has a series. At this point, it's stretched well beyond where it started, but started with, let's teach you how to run a game of D&D. And I'm going to do something similar, but I'm going to do it with Savage Worlds. Because in all honesty, on YouTube, when I look it up, there's a fair amount of people that have reviewed Savage Worlds, and I think it's worth it. It's a great system, as I've said. It's my favorite system. There's a couple channels that talk about it pretty frequently, and there's a lot of podcasts that cover it. But in all honesty, I never really see somebody that just really breaks it down step by step on running it. So that's what this is going to be. It's going to start as a small series, and hopefully it'll do well. It'll branch out. But I know it's at least going to be, this is a different page. It's going to be quite a few. This is like 7 different episodes at this point. And it's going to go step by step for someone who's maybe interested in Savage Worlds that wants to check it out. You might be confused by some stuff because, as I said in my Crunch video, this isn't a super heavy system, but there's a lot going on, and there's some different mentalities. So with that, we're going to start this with episode 1. And episode 1 is basically going to be the groundwork where we're going to work together, and we're going to build up to running our first session of Savage Worlds. In all honesty, if I were sitting there with you, this wouldn't take multiple episodes, but I want to go slow. I want to cover it because I'm not there with you. If you're confused on something, I can't repeat it. I can't explain just the things you don't get. Just like when I did my quick Savage Worlds overview of the things I love, I wasn't going into how to play the game. Here's where I kind of am. And I'm not going to do it as one big video. I'm going to do it in parts. So today, we're going to do the basics. And the basics of this Savage Worlds game we're going to kind of do together is just going to use this book, the Savage Worlds Deluxe book. I do that because one of the advantages of this game is for $10, you have a complete game. I talk about Basic Fantasy, where that book's even cheaper. It's like $5. But in my opinion, the game's not complete unless you download the extra stuff online that might be free, but you have to add stuff for it to really feel like a complete game. This isn't the case. There's settings I love, and we can get into that. But today, we're going to build, and we're going to get ready to run a session for people where you can be new to Savage Worlds, and your whole table can be new to Savage Worlds. This is a $10 investment. I'm going to say right up front, if that feels steep for you, just Google Savage Worlds Test Drive. There's like 3 different versions that came out, and each of them is an adventure and a very shortened version of the rules. And it's perfect. It basically gives you everything you need to try and build some characters and run that adventure. And they're great. I love them, and they're free. But I want to go a little deeper. So the first thing we got to decide is this is a setting neutral game. So we want to decide our setting. I'm going to cheat a little bit. In fact, this is going to be a lot of books of cheats because I'm assuming this is either someone who's watching it because you enjoy Savage Worlds and you just want to see more content, or hopefully either those people are sharing it or you're interested in, like I said, you're looking to see how to run. There's a lot of great cheats in this for new GMs. We're going to jump to the back, to the back of the book. Here's the front. We're all the way in the back. for sample adventures. I said when I was talking about, oh, this thing has a bunch of sample adventures. Well, that's the thing. We're going to pick our genre, but we're going to pick it based off the sample adventures here. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I already know which one I'm going with because I have preferences. But I'm going to read these off and kind of give you a summary. Because again, if you've been thinking about buying this and you're not sure, the adventures alone in this give you such a breadth of different one-off games you can do that again can easily be stretched in the full campaigns. That for $10 it's worth it right there. Before I jump into this, actually, I also want to bring up, if none of these sound great to you, go on their site. They have things called one-sheets. It's an entire adventure, one sheet. One piece of paper has everything you need. But again, my hope is to do everything from one book. No going online. No getting extra material. All right, with that said, disclaimer's hopefully over. We're going to cut into these. So the first one is called Knight Errant, Return Engagement. And basically what this one is, when I said my first adventure was this supernatural private detective agency where they were investigating a theater. Well, hey, would you look at that? It's that theater. That's what Knight Errant is. In this one, it assumes you're working for the Knight Errant Detective Agency, and you're a group of guys. I'm going to use that as a broad term. It doesn't mean male. Just don't worry about that. But you're a group of characters who work for this detective agency. You're hired to investigate stuff. Again, I don't want to give too much away. This is more to give you guys an idea of the genres and the overall setting. You're this supernatural detective agency. You're hired to check out a theater, and it turns out there's something in the theater. And it's living in the basement below the theater. It's a fun, simple adventure where I get into the setting rules after I read all of them. Next adventure, right after, if you notice, Knight Errant, it was one sheet and then another sheet for the maps. Because that's all you need in Savage Worlds. This is Blood in the Snow. I've run this one also. It's actually a really cool one. Especially if you're going, oh, I think I want to run something kind of fantasy, but I want it to feel different. Right here. Because this is Vikings. And some games handle Vikings. Savage Worlds actually has some settings that are just straight up Vikings. But this, you are just a group of Vikings. You're trying to get through the snow. That's right. You deal with ice trolls. This is actually a really good one if you want to know how to deal with harsh environments and weather. Because there's a snowstorm. If the character's thought to get like warm winter clothing, it helps learn those kind of mechanics. After that, see, we're already 2 adventures in and they're vastly different. This one's a little longer too, because it's dealing with hazards, so you got a few more mechanics. But you got this page, and this page with more maps. More maps are cool. Salvage on the USS Kane. All right, I'm realizing I've actually run a lot of these. This is a sci-fi one, and this one's kind of cool because this one can easily be a Firefly game. Basically, what it is you guys are all members of a ship. In this, it's called the USS Clark. In all honesty, just like with Knights Errant, we recalled ourselves Intrepid Investigators. Rename it whatever you want. But pre-written, you're USS Clark. And you're kind of the salvage ship. And you come across this floating ship out in space. It has a destructive beacon. You go check it out without doing too much. I do want to point out that it's easily a Firefly campaign. You go in and basically what's in there are reavers. There's these like mad people looking to kill and hunt you. It's a fun combat game that gives you a taste of how space games can work in this if you want like a gritty space game. It gives you some good feeling of horror. Knight Errant has a bit of that horror flavor over action. This is like straight up body horror stuff if you want it to run that way. On top of being sci-fi. And you can tone down whatever aspects you want. We're going to get into that a little later. Again, we'll go another, again, pretty maps. More adventure. I'm losing bookmarks. This adventure continues a bit further, just a little in, to Fires of Ascalon. This is their straight up, it's a small fantasy adventure. You basically are these heroes. You go to an elven town. You have to deal with some archers. This one has some negotiation, some diplomacy, some like social conflict stuff. If that's what you want to test out, or if you're really interested in like traditional fantasy, Fires of Ascalon's what you'd want to read over. Again, they're typically a couple pages. This one starts starts at the red, continues over. Another map. So we're up to what, 4 adventures now? All different genres, all different feels. And then the 5th one. And the 5th one's one a lot of people run. It's called Crime City: The Chase. It is straight up a modern urban game. Knight errants. I think, as I said in the one, it turns out there's a vampire. There's supernatural elements. Crime City there's nothing supernatural. If you want to play just kind of a real world game, Savage Worlds does it. And it does it really well. Now, I'm going to say a lot of people do Crime City because A, it's a heist adventure. Basically, it's a heist adventure. And B, it's got pre-made characters. Oh, pre-made characters are awesome, right? They're all kinds of fun. It's a pretty solid adventure. Again, it's short, but solid. That's it. So it's 5 adventures spanning all different types of flavors. Someone might say do Crime City. As I said, a lot of people start with Crime City. And a lot of people suggest it's a pretty fun adventure. But we're not doing that because we're not doing pre-mades. Kinda. If you saw my Savage Worlds video, you'll fully understand what I'm talking about. Also, if you haven't guessed, we're going to do the one that's my favorite. Knight Errant Return Engagement, because I prefer like modern horror, modern fantasy games. So first thing you want to look at is what they suggest the setting rules are. When I talked about, actually I don't think it'll be up when this one's up, but I talk about a part for optional rules. And in Savage Worlds, they call their optional rules setting rules. And there's a whole bunch in this book. Now, they suggest 2 setting rules. They suggest critical failures, which episode 2 of this, we're going to talk about bennies, because they're so important they need their own episode. But critical failures basically means if you roll double ones, which if you're used to D20 games is rolling a 1 on your D20, it's your crit fail. You don't get to spend a benny for a reroll. This is a much harsher thing than people will think. Bennies to get you out of trouble is a big deal. It suggests no, because Knight Errant is gritty, because the other optional rule it has is gritty damage. Now when we get into combat, there's the whole wounds. After you take enough wounds to get knocked out and incapacitated, you roll and you get like this lasting wound. Gritty damage, every time you take a wound, you get a lasting wound till that wound's taken. So if you get shot in the arm, that arm's crippled till it's healed. I'm going to strongly suggest, if you're going with me and you're making a game, and in our version of this game, we're ditching gritty damage. We're ditching it. Alright? It's a fine rule, and for certain flavors it's great. I don't suggest it if you're trying the system out brand new, and especially if your players are brand new, because when they say gritty damage, it stacks up fast. The wound system is a lot simpler, but a lot more deadly than it sounds when you just read, oh, up to a -3. That will knock you on your butt, okay? So we're going to ditch gritty damage. Because again, this says it suggests gritty damage. We won't do it. Now, if we want higher action, you could do Blood and Guts. Blood and Guts is in the polar opposite. See, the thing is in Savage Worlds, you can spend a Benny to reroll any roll except damage. Blood and Guts, spend a Benny to reroll damage also. Cool. This isn't a super heavy combat adventure. I'm going to say we skip it. Born a Hero is one worth skipping because it lets you pick, when you make a character, you can pick edges, which for people from D&D are like feats. You can pick them way above what you normally could, but only at character creation. We're doing something a little different for characters, so there's not going to be a lot of edge picking, and most characters won't get to pick their edges. So those who do are going to be a huge advantage, so we're jumping that one. We're keeping critical failures. Fanatics is a setting rule I really love for Pulp, because you have your big bad, and Fanatics rules, as long as your big bad has like little minions around, if an attack would take him out, you can just say a minion jumps in the way and takes the hit instead. And it kind of makes you have to get rid of the minions around him if you want to take him out. That's a maybe. It won't work well for this adventure, but if that's the tone you want, it's a good maybe. But I will also warn for new players, it's a rule that players who aren't used to this kind of game might feel a little cheated. So I'm keeping it as a maybe. I'm not going to put in this game if you feel your players can handle it and not feel slighted. And if you want big action scenes when we carry on past the first adventure, go for it. Because again, there's no limit on how many rules, as long as they don't clash. We skip gritty damage. Heroes never die is not a bad rule. However, I will say Savage Rifts has the version I like. We're not using outside books, but they have the version I like. In this one, it's basically, if something would say you die, you instead go into a coma. But it counts for your big villains too, and it lets you have reoccurring villains. So again, if you want a pulpy game, go for it. Okay, this one with your players. I have players who, when they hear Heroes Never Die is on the table, they're not interested because the stakes get lessened. It's more about fun and kind of like a campiness to it once you go to that. You're still telling stories, but the dramatic weight gets heavily lifted. I would never have it with gritty damage because it just doesn't work. High Adventure. High Adventure is a really fun one if you want to play with more of the rules. Alright, I don't suggest it for your first session because it's going to cause problems for your players. But basically, on top of being able to spend bennies on all the things you normally can, in High Adventure, you can spend a benny and you get a combat edge you don't normally have on your character. I believe, okay, one-time use. So it's not for the scene, but it's like that one use of that edge for a benny. The thing is there's already a lot of options in Savage Worlds, and this is bringing in all the combat edges basically as burnable options if you got the bennies. I love this in high action games. It's called the High Adventure rule. I don't suggest it here until your players are comfortable, just to keep them from feeling overwhelmed. It's a great rule, but let's keep it dialed back. I'm going to skip the next one because without giving away, that's the one we're going to go with. Alright, so multiple languages is another cool rule if you want to care about languages and building. Again, you're adding complexity. Right now, we're looking for fun and keeping the speed up. Because to sell Savage Worlds on your group, this has to be a fast game. You got to be able to play this game at a rate where they go, wait, it's only been 2 hours, but this would be like 10 hours in D&D. So, keeping complexity at a minimum. After that's the no PowerPoints rules. I'm not going to say here or there on that, because we're going to come back to this one. Because we have to decide if anything uses PowerPoints. If we're not playing with magic or anything like that, rule doesn't matter because PowerPoints won't get used. Alright? And that really, there's skill specialization. Again, complexity, you don't need it. We're going back, Joker's Wild. Joker's Wild is the setting rule I suggest, even if you didn't have critical failures. If you're new to the game, and especially if you want to sell it on players, use Joker's Wild. Because here's the thing, like I said, without getting too much into bennies, players spend them to reroll. Now, whenever players do something awesome, or play into their hindrances, or basically do anything the GM wants to encourage the player to do more of, the GM's supposed to give them a benny. I strongly advise you do this, but you're going to be learning a new game. And you're going to be juggling a new system. This isn't a super complicated system, but again, in the crunch video coming, I've talked about processor speed in the brain. Let's keep that low. Joker's Wild helps with this, because basically, when we get to it, one of the things about Savage Worlds is initiative is dealt with poker cards. And whenever somebody gets a Joker, they get +2 to everything they do. And it's basically like they just rolled a crit for their turn. It's really cool. Joker's Wild, whenever a Joker comes up, in their version, whenever a player gets a Joker, all the players get a benny. I run it a little different. And I know a few other people that run it this way too. And it's whenever a Joker comes up anywhere on the table, everybody gets a benny. That means the GM gets a benny, but the players also get bennies if NPCs get Jokers. I'm totally fine with this because at the end of the day, I'm not saying every wild card bad guy gets a benny. Just my pool. So I get 1 benny. If I'm playing with 4 players, they each get 1 benny. The players got 4 bennies, I got 1. They know the danger just got kicked up a notch, but they more than have the tools to deal with it. It keeps things interesting. And I switched over to this when 2 rounds in a row, my bad guys got jokers, and I had to remind my players it's only when players get the joker, and you just see them deflate because they'd already gotten it a few times, and they're like, "Oh, it's a joker, yes." This teaches them if you see the joker, it's awesome. It makes it a lot simpler. You don't have to remember who has the joker. Just joker came up, it's awesome. And it's a really good one because since it directly rewards the players, if you forget this rule, I can bet you after it's happened 2, maybe 3 times, if you forget, your players will remind you. You'll be like, "Hey, yeah, doesn't everybody get joker or bennies when the joker comes out?" I'm going to admit, this rule gets used so often. There are a lot of people at con games and stuff like that show up. They assume this is a rule. This is like in 5th where people assume feats are a rule or assume multi-classing rule. People assume joker's wild is a rule. It's one of those rules I use almost all the time, so I'm okay with it, but do understand any players looking or anybody who's just interested in it. It is an optional rule. Never assume it's the rule at the table. Make sure which GM. But for our game, it's going to be a rule. So we're going to have crit fails and joker's wild. So this means if you roll double 1s, when we get into the dice, you'll get it. Basically, you roll a dice for your attribute or your skill, and as a hero, or a wild card is what they're called. The big heroes and the big villains have it. You'll just roll a d6. You roll a 2, take the higher. If both those come up 1, you just roll a 1, and you can't Benny out of it. It does raise the threat. Every roll can be catastrophic. Additionally, that's called snake eyes in this game. People always try to Benny out snake eyes because it's not just something bad happens. You didn't just fail. Something extra bad happens. And with this, it sticks. So that's what we're going to do. So we have our adventure. We have our genre because it's tied to our adventure. We picked our setting rules. The last thing we're going to cover today is our characters. We're not doing actual character creation. As I said, if you've seen my Savage Worlds video, you know where I'm going with this. We're going to pick archetypes instead. Now, archetypes are basically pre-mades, but they're only like 80-90% done. They have holes in them for players to fill out, and they're not named. They're not even gendered. They're just these core roles that can be picked up. And because of that, players get to do a little bit of building. They get more invested in the characters, but most of the heavy lifting's done, which means they don't get overwhelmed when it comes time for character creation. So here's the thing. We're going to look at the archetypes, and we're going to pick which ones are going to be available to our players, because you don't want them all available, okay? Not just because it's too much, but because this is setting neutral. This is archetypes for any game, and very few games are going to have every archetype. So we're going to go down the list. The first one up is the driver. This is a modern game. Drivers would be useful. However, if you don't know if you're going beyond this adventure, I can tell you from experience, and the second you read that one-page adventure, you know, there's no driving in this adventure. Because of that, I don't suggest the driver. Just don't have it as an option. If somebody wants to later, they can take the edge ace, which basically is like what this one's built around, and they can become a driver. But for the sake of the starting adventure, just don't have it, because someone's going to get it, and they're going to be like, "Where's my car? Why didn't I drive or do anything?" They're going to feel let down. The next is the face. Remember, this is an investigation company. I suggest the face being there. We're going to have more archetypes than players. You want that. None of these are like, if they don't pick it, they're screwed. Just strengths and weaknesses. The face is your social character. Fine. Face fits in almost any game. Unless you're just like Blood Bowl. This is all combat. This is the Coliseum. No, do the face. Like, the face is fine in there. Now, we have 2 fighters. We have a fencer and a great weapon fighter. You're in a modern setting. I'm cool with the fencer. The fencer is kind of nifty just because they can still use a dagger. Like, there's no, these are the weapons you're allowed to use and weapons you're not. There's rules with strength when we get into combat. You have to be strong enough to wield certain weapons. But other than that, the thing is, it's a great weapon fighter is about these big, massive weapons. We're in a modern setting. He's not going to be able to do that. Now, if you're like a modern fantasy thing, you want it to be a little weird where like a guy can just walk with a broadsword down on his back and that won't phase anybody. If that's your world, keep him. Because that could be cool. But if you're looking to have kind of this somewhat rooted world, like, it's the world we know but different, he's not going to be able to use it. Like, he's going to constantly be getting trouble having that weapon. So just, for the sake of ease, don't have that as the option. Again, the character options taken here in the edges, a character can pick up later if it ends up where the game's going that way, or if they really care about it. But to start with the core of the character, we're going to leave him off. We'll leave the fencer, because that's a knife fighter. If you want to go, we know it's going to be in a theater. Maybe there's, like, a sword or even a fencing blade down there in that basement, and he can grab it and he can have his scene. That's easier to work with than the great weapon fighter. And if somebody wants to be that melee guy, that's where we'll go for it. The Investigator. This is an investigation company. I strongly suggest not only this one's here, but try and make sure a character takes it if you want to play up the mystery angle. You can just play up the action and adventure and don't make like finding clues really needed. You can just say they're found, little tricks. But if you want to play up the mystery, and especially down the road, if you want to play up the mystery of them having an investigation company and actually having to investigate, you'll want this one. The leader. The leader's iffy, okay? Leadership edges only work on their surface. I've talked about with rescanning when I talk about Savage Worlds, you can tweak it. But on their surface, they only work for people underneath the leader, people who regard that person as the leader. If that option is on the table, you have to okay that with the party. Like, this should have a huge asterisk of, if he takes it, he's party leader, and everyone has to respect it. Okay? Now, that also means you, party leader, don't be a dick. If your table can handle that dynamic, cool. Scooby-Doo, Fred was a leader. Let's be real honest here. He's kind of incompetent, but he was a leader. It fits in the tropes, so it can go. But I'm going to put a big asterisk on that if you want to have it. Now we get into an interesting one. I'm going to talk about one, and then we're going to jump to another one. And that's because this is the Mage. And the Mage, I'm going to pair up with the Weird Scientist, because they're both casters. The Mage is traditionally a caster. The Weird Scientist does the same kind of things, but with gadgets and gizmos they built. This is a point where we know in this our basics of the setting, but you need to decide if magic's in the setting. I personally am going to say yes, magic's in the setting, just because it also lets us discuss powers later, as well as I like magic in the setting. You can have magic and weird science. They won't clash, but I don't suggest it for a first time. I suggest magic just because people will grasp it easier. The mechanics aren't that different, but there's some differences. So I'd say start with magic, unless you really don't want magic, and then look at weird science. And if you don't want either and you want very grounded, that's fine. You can cut them both. We're going to start with magic, and that's where we couple back to the optional rules of no PowerPoints. I personally say no PowerPoints, because while I said you kind of have PowerPoints are these points, it's kind of like for magic, it's like a mana pool. And the powers they have each cost points. So whenever you cast, it goes down, and the pool goes up 1 point per hour, unless you take edges to go up faster. No PowerPoints instead, wherever the cost would be, half of that is a penalty on the roll. So they never have a mana that runs out, but bigger spells are harder to cast. And there's actually, those rules are longer because there's bigger consequences for failure and for, your critical failures. I personally go with no PowerPoints, and that's the one we're going to go with, just because in all honesty, your player can write down what the modifiers for each spell is, and that's the end of their bookkeeping. There's none of this mana going up and down. No reminding of, oh yeah, how long was the last scene so I know how many points I got back? No, you can just gloss it. And that's really handy in this system. So we're doubling back, we're kind of looping. No PowerPoints is going to be a setting if you have the Mage. Notice I said if you have the Mage. If you go with Weird Scientist, I actually fully suggest PowerPoints, because in that case it's batteries, and it's kind of like this reloading property. It is the extra bookkeeping. If you want that no bookkeeping, it will run fine, but their stuff explodes more often on no PowerPoint, and that can get real messy. So I strongly suggest if you go the weird science route, read it. Again, these are like small paragraphs for the most part. Just read them, look at the ways, the pros and cons. But for our system, we're going with the mage, and he's going to have no PowerPoints. We're also going to limit it to one, but we're getting that at the end. We now have the marksman. Modern game. That's somebody who's good with guns. Leave it on the table, because that fencer is really limited. If you have more than one guy who wants combat, marksman's going to be taken. Someone will take him. And it doesn't break the game. He can have a pistol, and it'll work fine. Martial artist. Similar. It's your brawler, but it's unarmed. Martial arts aren't super complicated in this, and really it's just your fists deal a d4 damage plus strength instead of just your strength. And there's no unarmed defender rule, which when we get into that, we'll talk about it. I personally tend to drop the unarmed defender rule again as a setting rule. I don't bring it up here because honestly I do it because I always forget about the rule. It's a very good rule, and it's a very balancing rule. And throwing it out does make these melee guys like a little beefier. We'll get into that in combat. But if you want the martial artist there, and remember, when we get into reskimming, the martial arts could just be the dude who's big and bulky. And in a few episodes, we're going to talk about tweaking these archetypes to fit better, because that could be like a bruiser or a boxer. But for now, he's the martial artist. He's the unarmed combat guy. We leave him. Combat is handy. It's not necessary in Savage Worlds, but it's handy. So let's have some combat options, so the players don't feel like, well, I want combat, I guess I gotta take this guy. Pilot. This is like Driver, just 4 times worse. It's awesome in games where pilots would happen, in like pulp games, but it's the most likely one to get cut in any setting, because how often are you flying unless the setting's built around it? So we're gonna cut pilot. Pirate. So the thing about the pirate is he's a pirate and he has boating and stuff. Without modifying him, he doesn't fit in the setting, and we're not going to be modifying this time around, so we'll cut the pirate. Pistolier. This guy is like the marksman, but the marksman, can do rifles, can do one hand. The pistolier is built around, I got 2 pistols. I will say, again, don't suggest the marksman and the pistolier. I would weigh having the pistolier in a setting like this over the marksman, because it teaches multi-actions. Because they get something called two-handed, where when they attack with one hand, they can attack with another on the same action. When we get into repeating actions, that's why this is very important, because they still suffer a penalty. And then they get ambidextrous, so he doesn't take an offhand penalty. This one very much helps teach a player how to do multiple actions in this. So I strongly suggest the pistolier. If you don't like it, or you feel like that's too many bullets flying in, but you still want firearms, you still have that marksman there. Again, don't need both. Priest or healer. This is where it comes back. We have the mage. We have the weird scientist. Your priest is your divine power. Because of how powers work, it's essentially the same again, but with different rules. I'm going to skip it just because of the flavor I do. However, if you want heavy religious undertones for a modern horror game, which is super common, it's solid. I'm also okay, unlike the mage and the weird sciences where they can't exist, but it does feel like it's too much. The priest existing along with the mage, it kind of gives a nice dichotomy of religion and occult that I'm okay with overlapping, even though it's 2 casters, because it can create character dynamics that'll be really interesting. So he'll stay for this as an option. We then have our rogue. Strongly suggest keeping, because the rogue isn't I backstab. It's the guy who can break into things for the party. It's the person who knows how to be sneaky. He does have an edge called assassin, which means it's kind of like sneak attack. He'll get +2 if he can be real sneaky. I think they threw it on just so it can be a rogue, and it's a good edge. It's a solid edge. But he's mainly here in a modern game to break into places, because as investigators, that will be incredibly useful. So he'll make the cut. You then have a scientist. Notice we said a weird scientist. They have powers. The scientist is just a researcher. It's just somebody who knows a lot about something. Or actually a few things. We keep it. It's left open for a good bit on what the knowledge is they have. Now, granted, they have one that's science, and you could change science to like occult, and it can be an occultist. He doesn't do magic, but he knows occult history and stuff. So that's worth having. Again, in an investigation game, having an archetype option of the guy who knows things will be useful. And now we're at the end. We're at the end of the archetypes. So we broke down this list, and it's a full enough list that you'll have plenty of options. So with that, we have all our archetypes picked out. I'm hoping I will like throw a list up kind of like around, I can't do two hands. There we go. Around like here with them down, just so it's easy to keep track of as you guys keep along. Those will be the options your players get to pick from. We already have our adventure worth reading through, and we're going to work on modifying it next time. In fact, I'm going to get to next time. So next time, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about bennies. That's going to be the main thing. I've talked a lot about it here, but I've done it very nebulously. It's a very important mechanic, so we're going to discuss that before we go too deep into anything. I'm then going to touch on tweaking the adventure, and that's really it on the next one. We're going to mostly spend it on bennies. But till next week, because this will hopefully be the every Friday show right now, I will catch you guys later. So, bye.